If you're happy to just start, Steve.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I very much enjoyed the previous presentations. And what I want to give is a bit of explanation to most people as to why we haven't taken the action we shouldn't have taken on climate change. And people tend to focus on the fossil fuel interests and vested interests, but I think it's been primarily the economists who are responsible for us ignoring the dangers until, of course, it'll be far too late to take a gradual approach, which is what they're trying all the time to encourage us to do. Leave it to the market. Let's nudge prices using carbon taxes. These are three very recent papers by neoclassical economists. One bunch saying that there'd be a 3.67. Notice the 2 decimal places of accuracy, which is enough to tell you you're dealing with lunatics. 3.67% decline in GDP by 2100 from a 4-degree increase in temperature. Another lot say that there'd be a 7.22% fall from another 3.2, which would take us to 4.5 degrees over pre-industrial. And another group claimed that losing virtually every significant tipping point on the planet would reduce GDP by roughly 1.4% at a 6-degree increase in temperature. This is lunacy, just sheer unadulterated lunacy. Nobel Prize winning Nordhaus, his claim in 2008 was a 7.9% fall in GDP for a 6-degree increase in temperature. These are all relative to what was supposed to happen in the absence of climate change. That's the IPCC one up here. And this is the most recent IPCC too. Warming of 4 degrees, 10 to 23% decline relative to global GDP without warming at all, which is basically nothing to worry about. And that's the message that has got through to politicians and journalists, where at the same time as scientists are saying, we're going to die fundamentally if you get anything above 2 degrees, this is ignored. Because what people listen to is not scientists, but they listen to economists. And that's a huge, huge mistake. Now, the question is why have economists made this mistake? And the fundamental reason is they're climate change deniers. The starting point they all seem to have is not denying that it happens, but they deny that it matters. And the basis of this is they think, well, capitalism, our model of capitalism, can cope with anything. Therefore, global warming can't be an existential threat. That's really about the only way to make sense of the sort of garbage that they publish very gleefully in all of their papers. You don't have to go looking in dark corners to find this. You find it in their published papers. Here's Nordhaus in 1991 saying, human societies thrive in a wide variety of climatic zones. Therefore, climate doesn't matter compared to other things like labour skills, access to markets and technology. That's a complete misunderstanding of what climate change is about. Again, quoting the so-called group of experts, 10 of whom are economists out of 19, 3 degrees would be small potatoes. This is literally the level of sophistication that they're coming up with. I'm almost sure this is Larry Summers, who's one of his 19 experts. It takes a very sharp pencil to see the difference between a world with and without climate change or with and without mitigation. In other words, it's trivial. And you would have seen Stuart Kirk from HSBC coming out and citing this and saying, basically exposing the belief in the finance sector that it just doesn't matter. Now, even though Nordhaus was saying these trivial things about what economists had to say, when he asked scientists, they gave him estimates 20 to 30 times as high as what the economists gave. He said that's an important topic for future research. He has done nothing about it in 28 years. And then again, the IPCC, the same old stuff. Now, how do they reach these results? Well, they make what they call simplifying assumptions. I call fantasies. And here's one. A roof will protect you from climate change. Now, it wasn't written quite that blatantly, but Nordhaus said that 87% of industry and producers in sectors that are negligibly affected by climate change. Now, what were they? Manufacturing, mining, would you believe, mining, utilities, finance, trade, most service industries, difficult to find major direct impacts over the next 50 to 75 years. This is simply a failure to think. And the IPC, the same sort of thing. Agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and oh dear, mining is going to be exposed. Therefore, they're vulnerable. Others take in controlled environments and are not really exposed to climate change. In other words, a roof will protect you from climate change. They have no idea of what it actually means. And the way they've made up the numbers that they then publish in their papers include using today's very weak relationship between temperature and GDP across the globe, across geographic space, and then say, we're going to assume what applies across space now applies over time as well. You know your mathematics, that's assuming ergodicity, for the climate, which is just nonsense. And they rather than being what they claim to be, which they specialize in economics and other things, people specialize in other things. They've made their own model they call integrated assessment models, rather than the GCN for global climate models that scientists actually develop. And not one of those models yet has included precipitation as well as temperature. This is from a 2021 paper making that point. Effects on precipitation have yet to be incorporated in economic studies. So what do they assume? They simply assume that if temperature improves by getting close to what they call an optimum, then so will rainfall. Would you trust these people for a weather forecast? It is just insanely stupid. So we tend to see the fossil fuel companies as the enemy in the whole battle about climate change and so on. Well, I say if they're the armies we're fighting against, the arm dealers are the economists. And their work is so bad, so transparently bad, that I think it'll answer culpable negligence, it'll cause ecocide, and they should be, once the climate of ecocide is instituted, economists should be in the dock along with the fossil fuel companies. Now, and it's so easy to criticize. This is what I found ridiculous. I thought when I started taking a look at their work, I'd need to explain why Ramsey model was the wrong model for long-term analysis of capitalism and so on. Instead, I found it simply look at their assumptions. And this is a paper I published 2 years ago. And the title is all I could say, The Appallingly Bad. Just doesn't deserve any professional respect whatsoever. And the hardest thing is getting used to the fact that you should not respect them. They simply don't know what they're talking about. And the most recent paper, the one that said if we lost summer sea ice in the Arctic, Greenland, West Antarctic, the AMOC, the Amazon rainforest, the permafrost frozen in the tundra, and ocean methane hydrates, and the Indian monsoon, we'd lose 1.4% of GDP at 6 degrees above current level. It is just insanely bad, stupid material that should never have been published in anything other than cartoon books. It doesn't belong in refereed literature. Now, to engage and let's start talking about what actually does make sense. And this comes into some of the work that Henrik and Carey were both talking about earlier. There is a very strong linear relationship between energy and GDP. The correlation, which you can see, is virtually 1. But also when you look at change in energy and change in GDP, the correlation is 0.83. There's the long-term correlation. That's world energy in, I think that's in BT, kilotons of energy of oil equivalent on the horizontal. The vertical is world GDP in US, I think it's 2010 US dollars. When you look at the change in one and the change in the other, they are virtually 1 for 1. The correlation set is 0.83, but those are both done on the same percent per year scale. So fundamentally, GDP is energy transformed into useful work. Okay? And that just emphasizes if we lose the energy, we'll lose the GDP. And that's going to happen because when you say, if we suddenly realize we've massively overshot what we should be loading onto the planet, what's going to happen? When energy declines, well, that will force a decline in GDP as well. And we'll be stuck with this dilemma. Do we let the energy fall? And can we afford to, in terms of our human civilization? But we're destroying the biosphere in which that civilization depends at the same time. And this will happen long before we get to the temperatures that economists are talking about, 4 degrees, let alone 6 degrees. So we're far overshot what is sustainable in the biosphere. Therefore, we have to reduce output and consumption, even if we're not forced to do so by a shortage of energy. And we need a mechanism to do that, which will put the burden of the adjustment on the rich rather than the poor, because we saw with the Gilets jaunes demonstrations in France before COVID struck, the poor are paying, living so close to hand to mouth now, and in most Western societies, you put up their costs in any one area, they'll revolt. So to hold society together, the rich has to be the ones who pay. And my preferred solution for this is what I call tradable carbon credits, a number of different names. Now, the proposal was, I first thought of it about 3 or 4 years ago, and I then found that a guy called Adam Hardy had begun doing exactly the same with a proposal he calls EcoCore. And I recommend taking a look at that for the overall idea. But I don't think anything like this is feasible politically before the scale of the change becomes apparent. And once the scale of the change becomes apparent, will it be technically feasible to bring it in? That's a real dilemma in both directions. So the second best is to say, well, let's just have huge transfers to the poor. We have to use the government deficit to enable the poor to buy the basic commodities that are related around energy and food, so they don't boil to death as they're doing in Europe right now, or starve to death as they're doing in Africa right now. We have to find a way to effectively provide a basic income for everybody as we reduce the income of the ultimate rich. Now, and the issue which was mentioned a couple of times here, and this is why I like the Mir work so much, can we transition to 100% renewables before we reach critical levels of CO2? And the scale, I think, is simply inconceivable to actually do that. That's why things like the Mir project are so necessary. This is with excellent work by an Australian mining engineer now based in Finland called Simon Maichow. And he's looked at what would be involved if we wanted to replace the 85% of our energy that is currently generated by fossil fuels. So if we look over here, this is the non-fossil fuel production in 2018. If we simply scale them up to take up the 85% of energy which is currently produced by fossil fuels, we would need, and the numbers are cumulative, 74,000 new biowaste stations, 600 new thermal stations, 69,000 solar power, 63,000 wind power, even the nuclear power, 834 new nuclear power stations. That's just simply to maintain the current ratios. Now, simply, we're not going to do it. There's simply no way we're going to get there. And if we tried to do it, we don't have the minerals anyway. That's the next point here. When you look at the resource usage we currently undertake to enable us to produce the goods we currently produce, we are exhausting the periodic table. This is taken from one of Simon's other papers, but it's actually a table done by the European Union back in 2014. And the green elements are the ones which we have in abundance, but the ones with different colors are ones which are in serious threat in various ways. Now, to me, with helium, zinc, and gold, and nemedium, which are essential elements of many manufacturing processes today, already with a serious threat to availability in the next century. Phosphorus, without which life is impossible, that is also on the endangered list. And there are very many others that we use for a range of lithium, obviously for batteries, which are going to be likely to be in short supply. So we've got a real resource constraint, and we have a economic constraint as well, in terms of we simply can't maintain the current level of lifestyle we have, but we can't impose the fall in the lifestyle on the poor. So we need to do two things. We need to work out how to finance the massive scale of energy conversion we're going to need. And you can forget about getting any guidance from mainstream economists, because as well as having bullshit theories about the climate, they have bullshit theories about money as well. They have no understanding of how money is created. They're useless to ask for a guide about how you can actually raise the money which is necessary to finance these activities. And the basic insights come out of what's called modern monetary theory. And that is the government doesn't borrow, it creates money. So it could create the money that's needed to finance this. And frankly, the private money system, which is where banks also create money, is likely to collapse when this crisis starts hitting, because there'll be so many companies that can't repay their debts. You won't be able to rely upon private credit. You'll have to have government money creation being the basis of our monetary system. And I've built a software package I call Minsky, which is designed for doing monetary modeling of that sort. This is what I call the Godly table from that particular program. I'll come back and talk about that in the discussion if necessary. But what it shows is that the deficit itself creates money. The government doesn't borrow from the public. When it runs a deficit, it creates money for the public. When it sells bonds to finance its deficit, it's not actually using the bonds to create the money. The bonds actually enable the banks to swap a non-income earning asset, which they get from the government spending, which are reserves, for an income earning one, which are bonds. And that's actually a bonus to the financial sector. And if the government sells bonds to the public, rather than that funding, getting money from the public to fund what the government does, it's simply reducing the purchasing power of the public sector, or the public, which we may need to do to reduce consumption, as we've done in the Second World War, to focus all our efforts upon the process of fighting climate change, rather than, as the comparison back in the Second World War was more parachutes, less silk stockings. And we have to relearn what we learned from World War II, that we don't use taxes for revenue. It's not a case of taxes to enable spending. It's the government spending and then taxes taking that money out of circulation. Now, rationing, I think, is also going to be necessary. And the idea here is where the universal carbon credits or tradable carbon credits come inside. And that is, we could use digital currencies to have the central bank create an account for every citizen. You could distribute universal carbon credits on a daily basis at a rate which is equal to the average carbon per country. So this is not an idea which says you have to have international agreements. I'd actually want to bring this in at the national level, because one of the reasons the fossil fuel companies like talking about international agreements is then they will never internationally agree. Okay? So we can do this at the national level instead. Every person in a country gets the average per capita carbon for that country per day, and all goods have two prices, a money price and a universal carbon credit price, which is based on the carbon content of the product being sold. Now, in that situation, given the massively skewed distribution of income we have, 95% of the population would have excess universal carbon credits to sell. The richest 5% would exhaust their carbon credits and have to buy off the 95%. So that would both be an income redistribution mechanism, but also extreme pressure on the rich to reduce the carbon content. And that's both directly through their own consumption and also through technological advances to get away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy systems. So that would be politically popular. Now, it would be opposed like hell for the power elites in society, but it would be popular with the mass once they realize this is what the idea was. And then it could be used for rationing when the scale of the crisis we face becomes apparent. And again, as I said, the EcoCore proposal that I mentioned earlier is the place to take a good look at it. An essential part of this, and I've run over very quickly, but I'm happy to come back and illustrate this on my Minsky software in discussion. Government finances will be vital for the transition. We can expect the private monetary system to collapse once the scale of the climate crisis comes our way, because you can't make a profit out of reducing output, and that's what we're going to be requiring people to do. So you need to finance investment while there's declining world output, and in that sense, the government is about the only way you're going to be able to do it.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. Thank you. I have a quick question, and then we'll move on to Henrik. If the private monetary system is going to collapse, but also we would need a world central bank to distribute these carbon credits, I mean, how can both of those things sort of be true at the same time?
You don't need a global. Money is national. Money is fundamentally a creation of a national system. So all the national currencies could continue. You'd simply say we have to add an additional parallel system to that, so that we put the pressure of adjustment by bringing in a carbon-based pricing system. And fundamentally, this is a transition to a system where money is based on energy.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Henrik?
Thanks for this excellent presentation. I really like it. Of course, I've read this paper about the appallingly bad economics, and I totally agree. I mean, it's like, I mean, it's there's criminal intent behind this, or basic, or I would say new classical economics is kind of like, it's a Bible school, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of they are sort of preaching something there. But anyway, but one point which I find so strange in this whole debate, both from economists and also from climate researchers, is that why aren't they talking about risks? I thought climate scientists are doing exactly the same mistake. I made a fun plot once about the carbon budgets. So you see this carbon budget, 50%, like some year ago, it was 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide for 50% probability or chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. Now, I mean, I don't question the models behind it, but I mean, who decided that 50% was a good, I mean, an acceptable risk? And if you then do the distribution, you realize if you want like an already with zero emissions, you have like a 20% probability of overshooting. And if you want like 95% probability of staying below 1.5, then I mean, the carbon budget is minus 300 gigatons. So I honestly believe that the climate researchers ought to be blamed, because they fell into an argumentative trap by sort of pretending that the problem is actually, that the risk is manageable. And of course, the point is this system is so complex and we only have one planet. So essentially no risk is acceptable.
Yeah.
And therefore you should basically say, I mean, forget it. It's like there's nothing to model here. We can't allow carbon concentrations to increase, period.
I agree. And this is, I mean, it's naivety of scientists, I think, because scientists actually are scientists. Economists are religious ideologues. Yeah. And the scientists are thinking, oh, well, economists are like the rest of us, and they must be translating our work into economic numbers. They're doing anything but. They're making up their own stupid numbers. And because those numbers are consistent with people who want to have a short-term interest in short-term profit, then their ideas get promoted. And also politicians and journalists have far more training in economics than they have in science, obviously. And they don't realize this is something absolutely critical. We should not have allowed the temperature to go above 0.5 degree above the long-term average, let alone the 1.5 we're at now, the 2 we're virtually locked into, the 3 we probably face. So it is treating an existential crisis as a cost-benefit exercise. That's the real problem. And I think we have to be ready for the work that Yuto is talking about, where we say, oh, okay, the ship is now, well, there's a bad analogy, but the ship is now sinking. Here's the fastest way to put plates on it so we don't all go down and drown. And that's what we need.
Thank you. Jesse?
First, very quickly, to talk about the apparent malfeasance of the whole system. There's also a very similar kind of neglect here that we're talking about symptoms and not causes, and particularly not the endless compounding of investment in multiplying the demands of the system on people and the earth. And Keynes pointed that out and got buried for pointing it out socially. So has everyone else. It's one of the first things I brought up in the 70s, and I can't get anybody to talk about it. But there are solutions. So anyway, to get to the simple question, this wonderful study, I think, pretty solidly points out that there is a problem, that there is a crisis coming. From this point of view, as well as others I've heard, and that government is going to be on the hook somehow. And but is it a choice ultimately, though, between business and finance stopping to compound their profits in multiplying their own power and realize they need to use their profits to care for the system they built, because that's the only source of profits in the future, is caring for the system we have. And I don't see government as really being an excellent agent for steering a whole complex economic system. So somebody's got to steer a system to safety.
We didn't commercialize, we didn't outsource the Second World War. When it comes to an existential threat, it tends to be the government level down that things happen at, and then the government provides the finance and directs the actions of private corporations that build the weapons. And I think the world, okay. And also the government can create money in the same way the private sector can, and much more effectively. The private sector, the money creation system is likely to collapse. Okay? I just can't see how it will survive when you suddenly find corporations are being forced to reduce output or losing money, and they're going to go financially bankrupt. So without a government money creation on a grand scale, and again, the scale equal to or greater than we did during the World War II, when deficits were regularly 20% of GDP every year, 25%, 40% of GDP deficits were common in the Second World War. And they didn't have to borrow the money, they created the money. And the money then financed the soldiers, financed the weapon manufacturing, and so on. So we're going to go into a world where government money creation absolutely dominates what the private sector does. And if it doesn't do that, then the private sector will collapse.
Well, I quite agree that that's the kind of situation we face, and that for things like a world war, governments do great. But then what do you do afterwards? Do you just go back to the system that created the problem? That's what would happen.
Well,
we don't have another solution.
Well, the other solution, we're going to have to become a creature that respect life and regard our role in the planet as maintaining life. And that's the first and foremost thing humans should be responsible for, not exploiting it. And that's a complete change in the ideology of capitalism we currently have dominating our system. So I'm quite aware of the need for that change. But I'm saying if you leave the transaction to the private sector will be Mad Max.
Thank you, Steve. Carey?
Yeah, just a short thing from your goals of this meeting and strategic kind of point of view. Yeah, there's a question of how much talk about change of, I don't know, technologies or people versus this idea that Steve is bringing up and myself and Henrik brought up, which are more conceptual. How much to get people to buy in any given set of actions do they have to understand this disconnect between the science and economics, right? That's a conceptual thing.
Yeah.
Do people have to buy into that or not? And at first, to decide to agree to other kinds of actions or move forward. That's just throwing that out there as a fundamental question.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the hassles is humans don't react to a crisis before it happens. Okay? We have social systems which benefit out of people being on the exponential function of whatever particular society looking at, whether that's, Romans conquering more territory or Easter Islanders using trees, whatever process is, the power structure amplifies the power of those who benefit from the current system. And even if you can say, look, it's going to crash for whatever reason, you don't get to listen to it after. Oh dear, it's crashed. Who would have thought that would happen? And then after that, then we react. Now, in the past, we've been able to react by moving somewhere else. The only person who's trying to do that right now on Earth is Elon Musk to Mars. And it isn't quite the same scale as moving from the Roman areas to the northern, the Gallic regions, whatever else. The motion simply isn't possible. So that is our real dilemma. And that's why I think a project like Talesmere is absolutely essential. We have to be ready as soon as we can to move in that direction to reduce the massive damage we're doing right now. Go into global cooling that we actually implement to manage the planet's temperature, because the chaos we're going to go through when the climate starts breaking down, again, it probably destroy our societies with the climate itself.
Thank you, Steve. Sally?
Yes, well, that was a wonderful talk. I really appreciated it. I particularly think the role of private for-profit interest-bearing money is critical to all of this, because what they do in the process is basically suck up money from the productive side of the economy and concentrate it into the speculative side of the economy. Yeah. In the end, you'd have, the bankers would own all the money in the world if everybody paid off the interest on their debts. So what do you think about, instead of talking about energy-based money, talking about constructive-based money? That is, when not only did World War II, they basically just made money by investing in productive capacities. But same thing happened with Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. He invented the greenback dollars, and the same basic idea. Many people say that's the big problem with his plan, is that the northern bankers were, of course, all against it. Anyway, but so I'm thinking that instead of focusing on the environment per se, because that's only one of many symptoms of this oligarchic overreach and excessive, just essentially increasing greed and attempt to own everything.
I'll just come in there and say that the finance sector has been allowed to be a power unto itself. And one of Marx's best lines, in the volume 3 of Capital, when he said, talk about centralization, the financial sector and the parasites that hang off around it know nothing about production and should have nothing to do with it. But the development of capitalism lets these roving cavaliers of credit take over the system and destroy it because they have no idea of what they're doing with it. And that's very true. So we have to regard the private monetary system as being a privilege that is created by the state letting you become a bank. And then the money which is created there should be directed towards productive purposes, not towards speculation, which is where it's all gone, certainly in the last 30 or 40 years.
So do you believe in public banks? Do you think that's a way to improve?
Hold
I do want to have some private banks because if you force banks not to speculate on share prices and bricks and mortar, where their own money creation actually is what drives the asset prices, if you rule that out for them, then you can have banks being better assessors of what is a reasonable risk for investment than a bunch of bureaucrats would do. However, you could also use these days the power of the crowd, and you could say, we're going to give everybody a certain amount of created money to use on, crowdfunding, and they put the money in, and the crowd intelligence can also direct where newly created money goes. But leaving it entirely at the behest of the banks and saying, invest in what you like in, that's what's given us the Ponzi scheme we currently live in.
Yeah.
Thanks for the excellent talk. I really liked your directives in communicating your message. So thank you for that. I have two questions. One is just a clarification. So universal carbon credit, if everything has both prices and the rich have money, so why would they ever need this carbon credit? They could just use.
Well, then you say, look, if you let's say the carbon credit, just for the sake of it, is let's say a ton per day per person, for example, and then you and I consume 1/4 of a ton per day, so we have 3/4 of the ton to sell. And then Bill Gates consumes 10,000 tons per day. He's got to buy 9,999 and 1/4 ton off the market.
Okay, that's very clear. So the other question is basically just for my own curiosity. You showed this a linear relationship between, let's take GDP and energy consumption. I think that's like global average or something, average data. If you look at the smaller scales and look at the fluctuation trajectories of these things over time on smaller scales, what do the trajectories look like? Do they go on both sides of the curve?
Both sides, because if you look at what's happening in energy and GDP in America, then the relationship has been declining over time. But that's because America has been outsourcing its production to China. Okay? And then you look in China and India, they've been having a higher level of energy consumption. They're building the base energy necessary to convert that energy into GDP. So at the aggregate level, that's where we should work. This is a global problem. At the aggregate, the link is ridiculously close. I used to say to my students before the financial crisis came along, and I was warning of it happening because of excessive levels of private debt and the change in debt, which is credit. I used to say that I wouldn't dare make up the numbers I find in the published data. And the same thing applies here. I would never have dared assert that the correlation between change in energy and change in GDP was 0.83. That's actually in the data. The GDP data comes from the World Bank. The BP provides the energy data. There's no overlap in how the data is gathered. And look at that correlation. And of course, it works both ways. There'll be times when energy rises and causes GDP to rise or fall. We can see that with COVID. Other times where energy prices rise and GDP collapses, we can see that back in the Yom Kippur War and the OPEC 1 and OPEC 2 back in the 70s. But fundamentally, what you look at, you can say quite simply, GDP is energy transformed into useful work.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was brilliant. Chris, are you ready?
Yes, indeed. I'm a senior research fellow at UCL, the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security, as is Steve, actually, but he's a distinguished research fellow. I'm just here because of my seniority. I'm getting old. Anyway, my background is in insolvency, fraud investigation, city regulation, became a director of what's now the biggest global energy exchange. I was responsible for the legal design of the UK natural gas futures market, not the physical market in buying and selling CH4 molecules, which is insane, almost as bad as buying and selling electrons. Set up a .com after that. And in 2008, was asked by Lord Reed, after 2008, to become a senior research fellow, looking at, you could say, what if the financial system that caused the crash in 2008 is broken, you can't use the same system to fix it. So what then comes later? And that's what I've been looking at for the last 10 years or so. You could say conducting action research is what I've been doing, as well as providing advice on energy fintech to governments, financial technology. And I'm going to be talking about network societies and an energy standard and explaining what economy 3.0 is all about. So first slide, I'll just rattle through this. I don't know about the neoclassicals and the capital and labor. I mean, that never made any sense to me. I look at it through a sort of reality-based prism as three-dimensional space, which is immaterial. It's energy, which is the only hard cost. It's objective. You're talking joules. And what I think of as intellectual capital, there have been economists who've talked about mental capital, like Friedrich List, for instance, but basically that which qualifies manpower. Keynes talked about unqualified labor, and basically what's multiplying exponentially is what I think of as intellectual value. Now, I have sort of analyzed an evolution of markets from in the beginning, and it's still here everywhere, especially in the undeveloped world, basically a people-based economy, which is decentralized but disconnected, where people are physically present in transactions, and it's everywhere, and it still exists. And it's the bedrock, it's the dark energy of the economy, really. Then what emerged over a period of many hundreds, if not thousands of years, was an intermediated economy where you weren't present in the market personally, but you essentially, your market presence was via middlemen who grew more and more and more sophisticated. And I'll come on to that. And the market in which we're evolving, and I sort of set up a .com, which I'll touch upon, you won't be present personally. You won't be present through a middleman. You will be present, well, you could say personally on the network. And what does that look like? What do the institutions and instruments of that look like? What will be the outcomes? In terms of mega trends, I always like to touch on this. We've touched upon energy intensity, I think. And we are seeing all of the easy resource has been extracted. And we're talking energy return on energy investment. Not all of it, but the energy return on energy invested is in a secular decline. Secular increase. And that basically means that we're reaching a point at which, resources are getting more and more expensive because, all the easy stuff's gone and all that's left is the hard. And in terms of fossil energy, that's what's driving the prices ever higher to, I think, a limit which we now reached. I'll touch upon that. The other trend, capital intensity, is a function of the direct connections of the internet, which essentially middlemen are capital intensive in terms of risk. You need a lot of capital to handle the risk or to actually handle the capital investment in major projects, whereas services are capital light. So we're heading into a world of smart services, which are capital light. And I'm just a definition here. Financial technology, in my view, is where law, accounting, and communications come together. And I'm going to touch upon that. So let's go to the next. Now, 2008, I call that peak debt, when it was a credit risk and bank solvency crisis and collapse. The government's introduced, or the Fed introduced, dollar QE liquidity into the market just to stop debt deflation. And since then, what we've seen is commodity markets, and all markets, in fact, becoming financialized by passive quasi-equity funds, exchange-traded funds, real estate investment funds, you name it. They're all quasi-equity, and they've completely financialized virtually every market, so that the real world future curves have all been replaced, if you like, by yield curves. But I won't go into that. That's a big subject in itself. Now what we've reached, and it was inevitable, I call it the point of peak rent. It started with all the excessive real property and capitalized rent, which you call mortgages, also IP rents, everything, all the stuff that we use, all the services that we use, communications and all the rest. And it's just, it doesn't leave much now for when food prices go up or energy prices go up in a similar shock. And that's what we've had. So energy is now unaffordable, other than to producers or the people who actually print the currency in which it's denominated. So what have we got? We got market risk has reached massive levels. It's a market liquidity crisis. And as Professor Michael Hudson says, if debt and rent can't be paid, it won't be paid, and it's not going to be paid. That's what's happening, breaking out all over the world now. So this is 11th century financial technology. I love this. It's called a tally stick, and I'll try and point the cursor at it. What it is a record. It's a transaction record. It's a single entry, because if you lose it, it's a bearer instrument. And if you lose it, well, you've got a problem. And basically, they took a stick, they cut notches in it to denote the number or quantity. They actually put a description of the counterparty. So this is basically a personal relationship. You can't trade these things, although some people think you could. It's A to B, and it's a record. But the really interesting thing for crypto people is it's encrypted, because the grain of the wood can't be actually, you can't, it's nature's hash. You can't actually forge a tally stick because you have to forge the grain of the wood. So let's move on to the next. Counterparty identities. Now, there were two types of tally. One was a receipt for past, not future utility, i.e. e.g. energy use, or it could be, it could be rent, it could be anything. And the other one, so that's a tally as a proof, as a receipt. The other one was a tally as a promise. It's a record of a prepay credit obligation, as I call it, to provide future utility. And it requires trust in the person who's promising. Typically, where it came from was the king, for instance, needed stuff now. You were due to pay rent or what would it be? What's the other one? Rental tax, damn it. So obvious. But the king wants stuff now. So you would basically prepay at a discount. And prepayment at a discount gave an absolute return. And the instrument was also the accounting record, and the tally stick would actually be returned to the investor, to the exchequer. And that would be the obligation settled. So what you had then, you had as a lawyer I know up here in Edinburgh said, all you need to know about law is this: you've got rights and obligations. Everything else is commentary, basically. So you had here, the asset buyers would receive a bearer title document, e.g. a deed, and the memorandum tally was proof of past value transfer receipt. I mean, proof of payment, what does that remind you of, anybody? Coins and Bitcoins in particular. It's issued by a seller in exchange for value received, identifying buyer and describing value transferred. The receipt has a zero objective intrinsic use value. If I get a Mars bar receipt and I offer it to you, you're not going to give me anything for it. Mars bar voucher, different question. And this is where we get to. Promises, credits, vouchers, returnable in payment for goods and services. It's prepayment. Prepayment is a form of funding that is not debt equity derivatives. It's always been around for thousands of years. It's been forgotten. And the very expression rate of return was the rate at which these tokens could be, stock as it was called, could be returned for cancellation. That's where the expression comes from. It's where tax return comes from. That's where the accounting event was. And the instrument was called stock, from stock and counter stock. Wooden stump in German would be a stock. It's all in the language. It was all there to be found, but it's all been forgotten and airbrushed from history. So, and a promise is a relationship, A to B, okay? It's not an object. And that is one of the most important things I've got to say. The money, if you like, credit is a relationship. It's not an object or thing, transactable. It's an assignable relationship. So what were the institutions in those days? Well, it was before corporations came along, you just had associations. Societies, common interest. Companies, common purpose. The word comes from, company, from panos, people who took bread together, bread mates, gathering for a common purpose, for a venture, like the merchant venturers in Bristol. Colleges, common knowledge. These are all associations predating incorporation. And they often then came to agreements to share risk, cost, and surplus. So rights and obligations, I think I mentioned that. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here, aren't I? Okay. Examples. I love these two pictures. Treasuries. Well, they issued sovereign promises at a discount returnable in payment for taxes or rentals. And you can see the cloth, the exchequer. Well, there's an abacus quality for that. That's where the coins were put. So the exchequer was a shared ledger. It was a ledger. And if you didn't bring coins there, you also brought the tally sticks there to the exchequer. And that's what the exchequer was. It was a ledger. Mints didn't do anything other than quality control and dispute resolution, right? They didn't originate the coins. They basically applied the standards to the coins. It was a quality control service provider relationship. So cantering on to the next generate paradigm, FinTech 2.0, double entry kicked in the Middle Ages. And this is an example of a bill of exchange. On the left, you've got double entry bookkeeping, and profit and loss came into the equation at that point. Rights and obligations, equity, shares in a joint stock company, debt, loan stock. You can see how it survives in the language. Essentially, the first type of undated obligation was it branched into two, which are essentially competing with each other. Derivatives come along later, although they've been around a long time. Fiat currency has been around in one form or another, back to the Chinese, but it sort of went mainstream around then. But all of these are exchangeable, tradable objects. They are not relationships. Very different. These are objects being transacted for profit. Institutions, this is where things went wrong. The first corporations were the crown. So you distinguished the person who was the king from the office, because otherwise it was really hard work to change all the contracts when the king died. So they actually created this concept of a corporation salt, which was the crown, still exists. And then the city corporation was the first. They started come up with collective corporates. And that's where it all went wrong. Okay, fighting talk. But you got public states, the Habsburg state, municipalities, city corporation was the first. Then we had other types of company come along since. But the problem with the collective is it's virtual. It's not an organic person. It's an inorganic virtual creature. And it acts through real people who actually have a conflict of interest as a fiduciary, principal agent problem, it's called. And these are intermediaries too, which alienate people from each other. They come between us. And it doesn't matter if it's the state or a PLC, we are still alienated from each other by these artificial creations of legal people. And you got the management capture, you got the tyranny of the majority, 51-49% governance and so on. And the concept of trust law is another one, trustee beneficiary. Well, trust law was invented by lawyers for lawyers. That's all I need to say on that. Right, now we've reached what I would call FinTech 2.1, which is a sort of middle ground between the one I just described and what's coming next. Todd Boyle, Seattle-based guy, he came up with the concept of he called it web ledgers. He was an accountant. And it's basically a shared transaction repository, shared database of accounting, of invoices, basically. My.com in 1998, I raised £250,000 to come up with a shared market transaction registry, because I couldn't believe that in that day and age, people still actually use telexes to confirm trades. So I raised that money, came up with a system. Everybody wanted to own it, but if anybody owned it, nobody would use it. So, I had a business model problem. And it consisted of a bilateral messaging agreement, shared database, i.e. a shared market ledger. This was the legal innovation, was the associative, is a market user agreement, a voluntary agreement I heard earlier. It's a globally applicable voluntary user agreement, and it worked. And what gave the security was unique registration in time order. Blockchains are not unique in time order. They are artificially synchronized with massive, massive use of energy. This wipes the floor with anything that came later. Why am I not a billionaire? Because the exchanges took the idea and made billions out of it, and I got nothing. So there we go. That's what happens. Triple entry expression was coined later by a friend of mine called Ian Grigg, crypto geek Australian of some skill. So quick canter here. Blockchain It's just an agreement between machines and devices rather than people. It's a collective machine protocol for encrypted transaction databases. It authenticates electronic transactions, so there is no double spend. They resolved a problem a different way to the way I resolved it 8 years before, 10 years before. The problem is the entire database is encrypted and replicated synchronously for every new transaction. And the coin instrument is a proof of past value creation or energy expenditure. Yes, it's got a subjective exchange value, but no, it has no objective utility. And it's an object, legal terms, in rem, anonymous null value object with transactions between named persons. And you have to have a third party involved, and you've always got this conflict of interest, or you've always got a conflict of interest with a fiduciary problem. So just an example here of something absolutely stupid. It was Venezuela's Petro crypto coin. Now, my position is that acceptability of currency is based on use value over time, utility. Now, there are many different types and qualities of oil, but consumers use gas, oil products, energy services. Only a few refiners use Venezuelan oil. And the Petro as a coin is an in rem proof object. It's not an in personam relationship. And they said, oh, it's a proof of payment, basically backed by oil reserves. But can you give it to them and pay for Venezuelan oil? No. Completely useless, complete idiocy, a lot of waste of money.
2 minutes, Chris.
Oh my God, I haven't even started. Right, okay. Well, FinTech 3.0, vouchers, rights and obligations, assignable P2P relationships. Let's go through it. I actually came up with an agreement called non-dominium, which is a mutual agreement between users, custodians, stewards, and I can't even see what it is down there, and investors. So I've taken a 3-party agreement and turned it into a 4-party agreement. Google non-dominium, and you find 2 papers of mine at UCL ISRS website. I come on to community treasuries. Non-dominium governance is about aims and principles, resource, social, financial resilience, which maps to environment, social, and governance. Permaculture principles is the same thing. Key point is governance, a mixture of cooperation. And the key point about a non-dominium agreement is no stakeholder dominates in this architecture. That's the key point. It actually is independent. And I go right through a whole series of different mutual risk, cost, surplus sharing. I reached Denmark. Now this is such a wonderful slide. You see on the left, the shape of the Danish grid in 1990, fossil fuel power stations. On the right, measles has broken out. Why? Because what they've been doing is looking actually at heat as a service and provide heat, cooling, power as a service, and providing it at least carbon fuel cost, which is the resource resilience principle. So pragmatic solution. That's how they did it. James Watt did this in 1778. He shared the fuel savings made from the use of his technology, a smart swap. This is what I did in Lithgow. It's just an example of the thing done in practice. This is where I live. And we were basically looking at taking the hotspots here and making collective initiatives for actually reducing carbon fuel use by using solar power to drive a heat pump, taking waste heat out of the sewers. But we don't sell heat as a commodity. We actually supply heat as a service. And so what the Danes basically did, I'm coming to the end here, one more slide after this. What they actually did with their least carbon fuel cost approach was to apply an energy standard. On the left is what you get from fiat accounting. On the right is what you get with energy accounting. Okay. And this is what happens with an energy standard. If you apply an energy standard, this is what you get instead of a dollar standard. And here's my Euro thought experiment. That's the last slide. Imagine if they fixed that Euro unit and fixed it to 10 kilowatt hours. Like after the end of the gold standard, everything would change and nothing would change. It's just the ECB can't print energy. Okay. And you would see a morphing of the system as it did after the gold standard. Okay. Sorry, I didn't realize I'd talked for so long at the beginning, but there you go.
Not to worry. Thank you very much. I believe Sally is first.
This was great. I really appreciate this. I particularly am curious about your domination, or however you pronounce that, governance, because I think that is central to the whole issue.
I'll put links in the chat, but carry on, please. Yeah, go on.
Well, this is like goes back to Plato, trying to figure out how to get the guardians to stay guardians. So what kinds of things do you do to help this, or how do you manage? I mean, democracy was supposed to be something like that, but it got co-opted over time.
Well, what we're doing, I'm now a community councillor where I live in Linlithgow. But the community council is not a corporation, it's just a residents association. And what we're going to do is basically come up with mutual agreements, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop us, right? That's the beauty of a mutual agreement. It's voluntary. Okay. So if we agree to share risk, if we agree to share reward or cost, like a farmers machinery ring, classic case, farmers club together, shared machinery, shared pool of contractors, shared cost buying, etc. But they still competed on quality, Sally. Compete on quality, cooperate on cost. There's all sorts of things you can do. And in my view, once the US catches on to this, there'll be nothing stopping you.
Okay, so have you heard of Mondragon and its?
Yeah, I know them well, Sally. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, I think there's a scale issue. So what happens when it gets so big that you can't really know each other? You need to do some of the advantages of efficiency and scale.
Absolutely. Well, the whole point about this is to go to local level, network, and then scale. These agreements, voluntary agreements, are what in the trade we call viable systems. They're recursive. Yep. So you don't get hierarchies. This is fighting talk, but this is the work we're doing. We're starting at the the most granular level, which is basically 4 people. So the Equal Care Co-op is a really interesting startup over here, which is just beginning to be rolled out. But this is very, very simple. And the agreements are incredibly simple too. Mutual agreements, Sally, are simple, because they say there are as many sumo wrestlers in the US as there are lawyers in Japan, because trust is assumed, you see.
Yeah, this is great. I appreciate it.
A non-simple question. You say that you don't get hierarchies developing, and what do you do about the whole system design around using power to multiply power?
Well, I happen to think that the people in power, the steering wheel's coming off, because what we saw after COVID was an outbreak of mutual aid, despite the local authorities, despite anything top down. I think in most Western economies, so if you like, what most countries, basically the scum has risen to the top. They've become hollowed out because the good people essentially have left to do other things. And I think we're seeing, in the world of fintech at the moment, there is a massive, massive outpouring of creativity. But in my view, it's been held back by the property rights, the absolute property rights of either or. Now, Sally touched upon Plato. My favorite book is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, right? And that, because I think Percy captured it.
Amen.
Percy captured it because he saw that it's about quality. It's not about quantity and absolutes and the conflicts between. We're talking about non-binary, and we're talking about logical states which are not either or, but are both and neither nor. Those are the 4 states, right? So we're looking at this with, if you like, different presets. But the beauty of it is, because it's voluntary, we're cool. We can, if the current system works, we'll work with you. If it doesn't work, try ours. Ours, and we just, finding little islands. We made a presentation to the Pacific Islands, a bunch of them, just the other night, and there's huge interest in it because they've been left behind. They've got a choice between, I think, the US to some extent has forgotten them, which is unfortunate, and the Chinese are after the fish, and we're saying, well, hang on a minute. we can actually help you organize yourself bottom up. And this is how.
Yeah, but we still have a world committed to maximizing the rate of growth, people and governments and all the owners of everything. So I'm not sure we've persuaded the quality approach, but the quality approach is where we're going.
Yeah.
And the question is how to make the transition.
Thank you both. Let's move on to Carey.
Yeah, it's just kind of a clarification or expansion on the idea that your FinTech 2.1 slides talked about the inherent conflict of a fiduciary blockchain. So and I guess you're working to get around that. So I don't know if you can kind of say that again about what specifically the conflict is and why it needs.
Well, you've always got a third party, and it might be trustee beneficiary, it might be the manager, it might be the miner, but there's always somebody who acts to facilitate the transfer between two people, right? I own something, you own something, and it has to be passed. There's like, I'm passing value to you, you're passing a different value to me, but there's not, how do we transcend that in minute period of time, right? It could be infinitesimal, but there's always we call it a settlement delay. There's always a settlement delay. And what it requires is a different approach to ownership rights. What we're looking at, and the key is to take the trustee beneficiary, if you like, and divide it into two, into the active and the passive. So the role of the custodian is to say, no, that's not going to happen until this instruction comes. Okay. So you and I could both remove our veto rights successively. You see where this goes? It's a different logical process, but what it requires is a mutual agreement that these are the rules. It's back to the rules. I heard some really good stuff about the rules. What we're talking about here is mutual rules, right? And within that consensus, not a machine consensus, but a people consensus. You'll have heard about smart contracts. The only smart contracts are between people. There are no smart machines, basically. There's so much bullshit talked in this fintech world by people trying to sell you worthless tokens. It's just incredible. So I think there is a massive, massive sea change coming. Financial technology, simple financial technology, is going to change the world at a speed that people don't even begin to recognize. And once honestly, it is a penny dropping thing. I can come on and speed through a presentation and the penny might not drop even after reading, everything I ever wrote, because it's one of these things light goes on moments. It's a paradigm shift. But best way is just to take a project, do it conventionally, or try to, and then do it this way. And you'll see from my writings how we can do it. And if it works my way, this way, our way, then you'll get it, because you'll see it happening. I funded a film this way. I've done a fair few prototypes. We're in rollout mode now. Property projects, IP projects, energy projects above all.
Right. So the conflict is just that the third party wants to extract some value out. Is that it or something? Maybe I'm not getting it.
We have a word for that. Bingo. That is exactly right.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Making sure. Okay.
You got it the first time, and I went all around the houses telling you got it.
I have a quick question. Based on what Steve said about the future of the economy, and the fact that he thinks the private monetary system will collapse at some point, where would communities or people build these networks for providing mutual agreements and smart contracts and all these kinds of things if the private monetary system is going to collapse?
Well, you do it yourself locally. I wrote a paper about, obviously it's an article 10 years ago called "The Community is the Country Currency." You can Google it. Do you know what the first credit card was? Diners Club. A little group of restaurants started giving time to pay to diners, right? Because credit is time to pay. Now, there were no banks involved at that time, but not everybody could actually settle the charge, because they were charge cards. So banks then started to get involved to provide liquidity to people who needed to roll it over. So we've got a big fat industry in which banks extract, but there's no reason why we can't come up with a mutual performance sharing agreement or mutual acceptance. And that's what I wrote about in those articles. Completely doable. And it doesn't even, you don't need any regulation for the people involved in it because it's like a walled garden. The only people who need some regulation are the people providing the service. You need a service provider to run it. That's all. Quality control. It's a bit like a mint, as I said in the presentation. You know what the treasury is? It's us. We are the treasury. And I think it was Minsky said that anybody can issue money. The difficulty is getting it accepted, which is a great line from a great economist, right? And I think if we have a mutual agreement says, yes, we will accept each other's credit, but it needs to be transparent, point one, and it needs quality control, point two, you just do it bottom up. And that, again, if you look at mutual credit and my name, you'll find a group of us really going for it with mutual credit bottom up, So it's all systems go at different levels.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. That was fab. Sally, are you ready?
I'm going to do sort of an apology in two ways to begin with. First of all, I've been recently diagnosed with Parkinson's, so everything's a bit shaky and I have memory problems. So bear with me, if you will. The second part is that I'm kind of an odd duck here, except for the last discussion with Chris's, it's right up my alley. But okay, I have a background in engineering. I started out doing high-tech R&D. I worked on the space shuttle and on cruise missiles and early point-of-sale terminals and early cell phones and digital switches. Then I switched to what I thought was my true love, which was psychology, and became horrified at the state of science and psychology at the time. Went off looking for something else, ended up in system science, where I discovered nonlinear dynamics and non-equilibrium thermodynamics as a way to understand why classical physics in particular, but classical science in general, was completely inadequate and inappropriate for human systems. And so I've spent the rest of my time actually traveling the world, working with different fields, so I've worked with educators and medical doctors and urban planners and finding out how all of them are actually experiencing I'll call it a Copernican flip, which is a shift from one way of organizing the facts of life to a different way of organizing the facts of life that is actually more accurate, probably more rigorous. And we're undergoing one of those now. And the shift is really between matter and energy is the basis of all things, and from separation to connectedness as the basis of all way things work, basically. So this is what I'm going to do here is a really short, simplified version of how I would explain what's going on to social science people, as opposed to you guys are more of the technical, very interested in the specific strategy. Anyway, so if you're talking about human systems, the main thing you need to start out with is realizing that we operate mostly on language and metaphor. And then we organize all of these things around a root metaphor that we then implement and create basically, people heard about the social construction of reality. Well, basically, it's the idea that we come up with a theory of how the world works. And then we have, we decide, like in the Middle Ages, they believed that, this was the world was built according to God's design, and the earth was at the center of the universe because we were the apple of God's eye. But they also believed that it illustrated the perfection of God's plan, that everybody should stay exactly where God placed them at the beginning. And so there was all of these social rules that went along with it. Anyway, so if you're looking at what's going wrong with our current society, we have one core problem, root cause of all of our interlocking problems, social, economic, political, and environmentally. And they're all, basically, it's a belief and value system, and we need a name for this. It's sometimes called cowboy capitalism or neoliberalism or neoclassical. I mean, all of these things are basically a variation on what I would call oligarchic capitalism, which is as Aristotle defined it, governed by the rich for their own advantage. And oligarchy is essentially an ancient cultural system of self-serving power, privilege, exploitation, and empire building. So when people use the word hierarchy, they're usually thinking in terms of an oligarchic hierarchy as opposed to a hierarchy that's simply a matter of it's, more bigger and more efficient on the top and then medium and going down like that, hierarchical branching systems. Anyway, but in an oligarchy, it's based on a master-slave mentality where there's superior and inferior rationalizes some people's right to exploit others. It rigs the system for elite advantage. It's an elite continuum of elite self-service and ignoring harm to others. It uses threat, leverage, fear, rewards, punishments to maintain elite power and advantage, and it distorts information and blocks reform that doesn't serve the elite interests. So this has been going on for thousands of years, obviously, but it's not the only way that we can possibly organize things. So I have been struggling with the language about all of this. I mean, my last PhD was in ostensibly system science, but it was really about the energy non-equilibrium thermodynamics and how that and nonlinear dynamics. Well, let me tell you, anytime I put those two phrases together, people just turn off and tune out. So I've been trying to figure out a different way of articulating it. I'm coming up with the idea of energy system science, which is an umbrella term for disciplines that study the role energy forces and flows play in systemic health, growth, development, intelligence, and evolution. And not only do these disciplines include nonlinear dynamics or chaos theory and non-equilibrium thermodynamics, but it's also things like ecological economics, panarchy, circular economies. There's just, when you get into it, there's a whole bunch of different disciplines that are basically working on similar kinds of concepts and processes, but just under different names. Okay, well, the root change that an energy system approach comes up with is that economy is really a society's metabolism. It's a flow network whose collective activity turns energy, information, and resources into all the goods and services, fuel, and learning that a society needs to thrive. But the other part of it is that if you integrate information as, basically interference patterns create these little blips, which when you add fractals, you're able to actually have small things have a significant impact on your overall system. So I believe when you integrate intelligence and information into our systems theory, that you end up with a literal understanding of humanity as a collaborative learning species, where our main strategy is to pool information, find better ways, and change our behavior rapidly by changing our beliefs. I mean, this is why we talk and build scientific theories and why we're on a continuum with other animals who also use information and communicate, but we're definitely, that's our main survival strategy. Okay. So if I put all of the pieces of energy system science together, I end up with four main factors or categories of elements in systemic health. Two are cultural factors, collective learning, and common cause values. Two are economic factors and their regenerative circulation and resilient fractal structures. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through what all of these are. All right, so the basic physics is pretty obvious. If you do self-organization theory, what happens is that under pressure, sufficient pressure, a gradient, like if you're doing a hurricane or a tornado, or boiling water is my favorite example. You turn up the heat and the energy circulates faster and faster, and by random collisions until it literally can't go any faster. And then you get this growing gradient and inability to proceed, in which case small bubbles begin forming up the side, and one of them eventually goes to the top, loses its heat, triggers a circular movement that goes around and around, which essentially serves to dissipate or move energy faster than it was before. Okay, these are all kinds of flow networks. As systems exist, it depends upon the robust cross-scale circulations of critical resources to fuel activity. So in all cases in self-organization, smaller bodies align in ways that increase the capacity to work, which is make things move. If you happen to have a self-nourishing one, or also called regenerative autocatalytic circulation, those increase longevity, so they exist longer. So when you see it, both your metabolism is organized so it connects to the outside in ways it brings in the energy and resources it needs, and then it circulates them throughout its capacity, and that's what fuels activity. Same thing basically with when you see an ecosystem in the biosphere. It's all circulation and motion and this whole interconnected network that serves to move energy faster and in more nourishing ways. Okay, so the far right little chart is about increasing development requires increasing internal circulation. So this is the work of Eric Faison at Harvard and Tufts. He's been working on what he calls cosmic evolution, which is basically the energy flow theory of evolution as growth and development. But he charts flux density, which is the energy cycling per unit time and unit density, ergs per second to the -10 per grams per the -10. Anyway, if you do this, you can basically use energy cycling throughout the whole system as a way of essentially assessing development, because you need that energy in order to support the development. Okay. So the socioeconomic implications are that where money goes and how it is made is more important than how much is exchanged. So GDP really is it's basically equivalent to total system throughput, which is in terms of ecosystems. But it's only the volume. It doesn't have anything to do with whether it's constructive or not. It's just, so in our case, you have speculative processes, particularly the financial ones. They up GDP incredibly, but they don't serve they're not nourishing the underlying health of the system. So that really, if you want to have, where things go is particularly you need to invest in your organization, its human capacities and the infrastructure, because they're what do the work and learning. So anyway, the other part of it is that in order to optimize circulation and function, basically, because you need to fuel activity, you need to have resilient or fractal structure. So this window of vitality in the beginning, in the middle of here, is basically the work of Robert Olanowitz, who's a theoretical ecologist, and this is based on study of real life ecosystems, but it also corresponds to the general fractal hierarchies that you see throughout in all kinds of different systems. So you see trees, lungs, ecosystems, circulatory systems, and even banking systems all have a balance of small, medium, and large, or also a balance of resilience and efficiency, because resilience basically increases with the small, diverse, and greater flexibility of in large numbers of small elements. But you also need large scale or multi-scale organizations also need efficiency, so they need a balance between these small guys and the big guys, because both sides are relevant. So what you get is an understanding of why, for instance, you have your circulatory system has small capillaries in order to get nourishment down to every cell, but it also has medium to get them cross scales into larger organisms, and it has large scale for cross scale transit, because the combination optimizes cross scale set nourishment and circulation throughout the whole system. So basically understanding that there are universal geometries that reflect optimal arrangements over time, and the geometric precision of those arrangements, because those are all fractal hierarchies are all power laws, so they have a particular balance of small, medium, and large as they go up. But this will allow us to help us assess systemic health by figuring out how well we are towards the optimal balance of big and little, but that's also an optimal balance of resilience and efficiency. And if you add fractals, it's actually also a balance of diversity and coherence and flexibility and constraint. Okay, so, but most importantly, this tells you why the endless focus on optimizing efficiency and size is doomed to failure, because eventually you're doing what you're doing now, which is that you undermine the small scale diversity, because the larger the size, more tendency towards a positive feedback cycle, which is going to concentrate wealth even more. So, so what? So the whole economic endeavor, which is focused on GDP growth and maximizing efficiency, is doomed to failure by the nature of systems and the need for circulation.
Go about 5 minutes, Sally.
Oh dear. Okay, so I just went past a whole bunch of stuff. Anyway, so you have similar another law is the surface volume law. So the bigger you get, more the bonds holding of the system together get stretched to a breaking point, which is the ratio of the surface to the volume. And that results in, well, okay. Anyway, so the bigger you get, the more you have to have small things connected by connective tissue, which is what happens with all these guys. Anyway, hold on. When you have information becomes central to living organisms, because that's how responding functionally to small energy trails is how we manage to find food, which is how we manage to continue. And so expanding both information and communication throughout is what happens. And that is basically the definition of how you get increasing complexity in living and super living systems. Okay, so oligarchies tend towards instability because they violate the main laws of systemic health. So on the far left, this is from Money and Sustainability, one of the books I worked on with Bernard Lietaer. And it shows that the amount of money being invested in the real economy is basically microscopic compared to that being invested and circulated in the speculative economy. Next one is from Robert Reich, Inequality for All, which says the more you let big guys concentrate as much as they want, the more instability you're going to get. And the third one, as opposed to taxing it away, which is one of the reasons why there were fewer banking failures and crises after they implemented the New Deal under FDR. Anyway, and the last one is the functioning of the U.S. Congressional system, whereby this is a listing of the likelihood of a policy getting or passed, depending upon whether it's preferred by elites or the public. And so basically, there's about a 30% chance of getting implemented if 80% of the public likes it. But if elites like it, it's basically got a huge percentage of chance of being. Anyway, so the large basic result is that oligarchies create a wealth-sucking vortex that creates economic necrosis, because it causes the dying off of large swaths of economic tissue, which creates growing pressure for change. So this brings out the cyclical struggle to learn. So if you actually look up throughout history, and actually prehistory too, there's all these ways where we've been struggling to get past oligarchic abuses, because they're essentially responsible for the collapse of complex civilizations, which is that more common than most people realize. We have, however, managed to come up with better ways. So we've implemented, written laws and applied them to elites. We've got civil rights. A lot of things are really ways to minimize the abuse that happens with oligarchies. Problem is that oligarchies tend to come back and they take the new golden theory and they turn it into a corrupt form, and then just push harder on the same oligarchic ways. So instead of living, the Enlightenment was all about trying to do well, actually, medieval started out with trying to do God's design on earth. And in the end, it just became elites, aristocratic and church struggling. They created incredible amounts of pressure because of this, malaise. So I think we're on the cusp of a new learning challenge, which is why when you look at a collapse of a complex civilization, it has everything's is brittle and so the crisis the final collapse can come from anywhere. It could be economic or financial or social or political or environmental. In fact, all of those things have happened before. So I work with a group called the Research Alliance for Regenerative Economic, also the acronym is RARE. And in 2019, we published our top 10 measures of systemic health. They're currently been actually attempted on, actually one of our guys has worked on industrial flows in China. And so looking at cross-scale circulation, where does the money go? How is it invested? How is it used? Whether it's actually going into education and infrastructure, the kinds of things that actually improve the productivity of the system and work capacities. Reliable inputs, healthy outputs, that's basically sustainability, which it should be formatted as risk factors. Resilient structure, you can look at the balance of sizes. Do you have just too many big guys and too few little guys? And which anyway, onward and upward. So what we want to try to do is move towards inclusive prosperity and the economics of belonging, which is sustainable vitality comes from a virtuous circle of well-being, engagement, and common cause, circulate robustly, learn collaboratively, distribute fairly, institutionalize common cause values. So this is one of those things that if you actually curb elites' ability to concentrate wealth by two tax things, this is from, again, it shows that in the height of the Great Depression, they had 4,000 bank failures in the U.S. alone in 1933, and then they implemented the New Deal increases in, what was it, 95% of the income was taxed away for elites. And that spawned a 50-year unparalleled prosperity where money was circulating better. So, okay. So seeing humanity as a collaborative living species explains why we can build a better world. Energy systems laws of health and development show us how to do so, and its predictive principles and precise measures provide empirical markers to guide our steps. The other way to think about this is that this is a way to integrate our societal heads and power. So I'll stop there. Sorry to be so brief.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was fascinating. Carey, please.
Thanks, Sally. I guess I was waiting for you to define oligarchy and hierarchy. And my thought is when I think of biological systems, would you, like an ant colony, would you be able to use your methods or ideas to say whether they are or are not oligarchic? Or is it just that hierarchy emerges because of if you get larger, you will have division of distribution?
No, I think hierarchies are absolutely necessary for groups beyond a certain size, whether they're, it's cells or ants or anything else. You need some kind of ability to centralize and, anyway. So I believe they're basically necessary, and that's why they exist all over the place, because they serve a function. No, the problem is whether or not they are designed to, they've got a positive feedback, because they're all designed to essentially funnel everything to the top. So hierarchy does not necessarily mean that they are solely a matter of funneling resources to the top and concentrating and maintaining it's the ability to do that. So for instance, in American Indians or Scottish clans had a clan head, but he's not. Same thing with Indians, American Indians. You don't have them. The guy who's on top isn't necessarily vastly wealthier than everybody else, and he doesn't have the power to extract wealth from the people in the other people. So oligarchies are a stage of development, which we've been trying to outgrow for millennia.
Would you just say oligarchy is a hierarchy in which the proceeds are directed to the top, and you could have a hierarchy with no oligarchy in which the proceeds were equally distributed? And we have examples of this in history or something like
yes, exactly.
Okay, thanks.
Jesse?
About the learning challenges. I've done some studies of the remarkable constancy of growth rates of the world economy over time, and notice that if you look at their shape in detail, you see certain pauses distributed in an otherwise constant growth rate that seem to be retooling periods. Would you think that's likely to be one of the things that people call recessions, but are really part of growth?
Oh, interesting. I don't know if I would call them recessions, but certainly the whole business of having basically one pattern of organization, it accelerates things to begin with, but then it reaches basically saturation. And it can't go any faster in that particular pattern. Or at which point the system can either stop growing, or it can change to a new pattern, reorganize in a different way, or it could continue on its certain way, in which case it'll essentially collapse. And it does that by, particularly if it blocks the retooling, as you would call it, the innovations, the new ideas, the diversity that might come up that would indicate a better way, then yes.
I'm thinking of retooling as coordination of the whole system with new innovations that are distributed, stuff like that.
Oh yeah, no, I think the innovations almost always begin as not as decentralized. It's only after time as that, so there's kind of a open space hypothesis. So if you come to the new world and there's all of this, and you have the capacity to harness all of these resources, then you're going to grow like crazy for some period of time, but then you're going to saturate, fill up. But they all start small. But what happens is that, like in the auto industry or computers or anything else you want to think of, you start with a whole bunch of small guys trying this field out or developing this field, and then they grow, and then they consolidate, and then that's pretty traditional.
Thanks, Sally. That was really, really good. I can see why you were on just immediately after me. There was method.
Oh, yes.
There's method to your madness, Rachel. That I knew. Absolutely. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Lots of things I like to say. I haven't really got time to do it. But, for me, oligarchy is, derives from the legal structures we use. Now, that should have come across by now, but that's what I believe. It's the legal forms. So I'm looking at agreements, mutual agreements, rather than organizations which are inorganic. For me, fractal is like inorganic, okay, and commodities are sort of inorganic. And there's a guy I know called Trevor Hilder. I put a link to his Web of Wealth site, who's a student of, knew him well. I worked with him, Stafford Beer, cybernetics, and his work on recursive, organizational design, if you like, is he and I work very closely together. Where he works with protocols, I work with pros. So that's that. And just as an example of a bottom-up system, I'll give you Switzerland. Most Swiss don't even know the first minister is, because they don't give them any power. They only delegate upwards the functions which require a more strategic level of empowerment. Most of it's actually decided at the local level, with one exception, and that's the central bank, of course. What a surprise. So I'm just chucking that into it. And, and the leader, I would say a leader who is sort of given a mutual respect. He's there because he's the top warrior or the best of his subject, whatever it is. That's delegated sort of liquid democracy, isn't it? and it requires consent, whereas an oligarch rules without consent. And I'll stop there.
Here, here. Yes, these are, I mean, I'm still struggling with what is the innovations. Actually, I really enjoyed your talk, partly because you were hitting on all the kinds of things that I think we need innovations in order to be this next stage. I don't know what you call it. In fractals, they call it a heterarchy. A heterarchy is basically a more distributed hierarchy, so that it's not just control up and down. It's more circulatory, and there's more parallel side to side kinds of things. What you can building from the bottom up or the top down, again, it turns out that there's a momentum effect with attractors, which means basically that they co-evolve from the bottom up and the top down. So for whatever that's worth, I think there will be a point. And part of what I would like to do with you is provide you with a relatively common sense way of explaining why these things are necessary. So for me, a lot of our problems stem not just from the implementation of the requirements of maximizing profits only for elites, and then ownership and all these other kinds of things, that debt-based money, all of these kinds of things are innovations that have been developed in order to concentrate wealth and power more completely. Why was I talking about this? Anyway, I think those kinds of things are going to need to be rethought. And I think they'll start out, I think I know what it was. We need to change the paradigm. And we need the Copernican level flip. And we need to start talking about this stuff in ways that we can understand each other, about why it's relevant to the social. Because frankly, for me, part of the problem with sustainability is that they made their case. People were very concerned about the health of the planet. But at this point, the health of the planet is now down there for most people below jobs and taking care of your kids and getting out of debt and paying for education and healthcare and owning a home. All those things that are day-to-day kinds of things. That's what's creating the social pressure now. And so in a certain sense, I think we're at a stage where the social pressures are reaching a critical point. And we need to have something to offer people that it's relevant to their everyday lives and that speaks to their needs. And how do you go about meeting those needs? So it's a language change as well as a metaphor change, and how you say all of these kinds of things together.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Sally. Henrik, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's kind of a question for everyone in this group, because I think it's interesting. I've noticed that I have been sort of traumatized by my working in a big engineering company, because there the problem is, of course, that if you do calculation in an engineering company, someone is actually going to invest a couple of millions in building the thing, and if it doesn't work, then you have a problem. So you're very strong on the empiricism part there, that it actually has to work. But anyway, I mean, so when I think about this global or the sustainability problem, I think we should call it the sustainability problem, not just climate change problem. I mean, there are some things that, a couple of dimensions that I think we have to discuss very clearly. One is global versus local. Is it really a problem that can be solved locally, or is it something there where we actually have to work together? And I mean, this question is, of course, extremely relevant because, honestly, I don't know, someone might be better informed. I'm not sure that it's possible to feed 8 billion people sustainably on planet Earth. So, and then, of course, that gives us, if we do serious like thermodynamic investigation of this and realize that it is probably not possible, then we have a very significant and serious redistribution problem. And this has nothing to do with money or whatever. It's simply that the food that would be needed cannot be produced anymore. So that's one dimension, global versus local. The other thing is that I find very interesting is, of course, the trust. I mean, the word trust has come up here quite a lot, and what I'm struggling with is it the good guy problem or the bad guy problem that we have here? I mean, a typical example of a bad guy problem is, of course, gun laws. I mean, 99% or 98% at least of gun owners are, of course, perfectly reasonable people who are not going to shoot anyone. So by thinking like that, you say, okay, 98% people are reasonable, and you don't need gun laws. The problem is, of course, that the 2% who are not reasonable cause enough problems to make gun laws necessary. So these would be like the two dimensions I would want to think about. Like, is it a good guy problem or bad guy problem we have to solve here? Should we focus on the bad guys or good guys, or should we, and is it like a local or a global problem we have to work on?
Oh, okay. So let's see. The good guy and bad guy, is it most people are not good guys or bad guys. Most people are doing what their society tells them they should be doing.
Okay.
And particularly when you're talking to people, you don't want to put it in good guys and bad guys. So the other part of it is that the reason we have, I mean, particularly in America, there was in terms of guns and good guys and bad guys, there was a film called Bowling for Columbine by Michael Moore some years back, which looked into all the reasons why America has a particular problem with not just guns, with violence of guns. Because one of the things they pointed out was that Canadians have more guns per capita at that time they did than America, but they don't have any kind of a problem with people shooting each other. This has actually, so in terms of psychology, the problem is that we've created a society in which, you're constantly struggling against being ripped off by one person or another, and you're confronted by lots of thousands and thousands of angry, frustrated people who can't get a job, and their homes are falling apart because they're stressed by bills and healthcare and all these other kinds of things. So we've created people who are likely to be violent because they're completely disconnected from the health of the rest of society. And that too is, I mean, we have biologists running around saying that evolution is run by selfish genes, and that's just nuts, or this whole idea that winning is everything. And so we've lost that connection to the common cause, which is one of the things that Chris was talking about. So so for me, a lot of this is we need to really work hard on how do we articulate this new paradigm and make it relevant to people as opposed to just environment per se. I mean, environment is really important, but it's only one of the possible causes of collapse.
Yeah, actually, Sally, I was going to just try to summarize the thought from Henrik's question, but then Sally brought up another one per the selfish gene. Now, I think Dawkins even said he didn't like selfish as the word. I think he wanted to use immortal gene. So I probably disagree with you on the interpretation of that, which is sort of the point at the end of my presentation, which was, is there some sort of whatever pushes evolution forward, do we understand it, or how much do we need to understand it? Do we have to, if you sort of accept maybe the wrong word, let's just take as the hypothesis that there's some growth imperative going forward that we humans didn't invent, and evolution and natural selection is the language in which we try to explain this for non-human systems, then per Heinrich's, and made me think of Chris Cook's stuff, if you can create local arrangements, he brought up local versus global. If you can create local arrangements for people to do something different than whatever the larger economic, organization is, and profit seeking and this or that, how does it do something besides just stay local? So I don't know for Chris's ideas how much I could be linked to him, who's physically in a different location, that we somehow agree to do something different, that we have some mutual, whatever benefit we perceive out of it, we have some mutual benefit, even though we don't physically maybe ever interact, but we can interact in the way we're doing right now, and we have some agreement. Local heat management is a sort of obvious physical arrangement, but how would I interact with Chris with some mutual agreement that somehow we get a benefit out of? I don't know. We have the communication and the technology to arrange that to some degree, but I don't know what that would be.
Well, there's just lots of sociology about the diffusion of innovation. And so it's not, I mean, the other is the metaphor of the battleship. How do you change it? How do you turn a battleship, which is all this incredible momentum going forward, and it's got a 12-foot rudder that you can't really fight against the pressure that is in place. Well, you have this little trim tab, and so it's only 6 inches wide, and it's the pressure, the resistance to that small thing is small enough that it allows you to shift the momentum. So, I would say basically that human systems learn all the time, and it starts small and it just gets bigger depending upon its ability to actually make a difference for people.
Just a short comment to this. Thanks for these thoughts and ideas. I mean, I guess I'm a bit shell-shocked, like sitting in Sweden here, because we shouldn't forget that, of course, our political systems work, and they're very good at doing many things, just not fighting climate change. So, for example, in Europe now, I mean, I don't know how much you have, how informed you are about this, but I mean, the Russian attack on Ukraine led, of course, to Sweden to make, I mean, the largest change in its foreign policy since ever, basically. I mean, Swedish neutrality was like a cornerstone of Swedish diplomacy and everything. And suddenly Russia attacks Ukraine, and immediately they apply for membership in the NATO, which is like without any political discussion, and a massive boost in their defense budget. There's no discussion. There was no debate about this. This was just pure fear causing this to happen. Germany was basically the same. I mean, there was NATO members, but they decided to massively boost defense spending and cancel their policy of not exporting weapons to countries that are actually at war.
Could I just jump in and give Denmark after 1973 oil shock? They had a very similar moment. I call it an oh shit moment, because the price went up from $3 to $12 almost overnight, and they were fueling themselves with it. So that's where that policy, very pragmatic policy of, okay, for any given delivery of energy services, we will minimize oil and gas use. And that is the strategy they followed for the next 50 years until, it's been delayed, shall we say, by neoliberal economics and the complete nonsense that is the energy market in Europe now. But that's going to collapse soon enough. That market is just complete nonsense. Yeah.
No, I like the term. It's kind of the oh shit moment. And is that in those cases, governments seem perfectly capable of acting.
Well, it's bipartisan, isn't it? It's one of these things which is existential and also a common sense solution. I mean, the climate. One thing that we've noticed in our discussions internationally is this: that we say, well, it doesn't matter if you're a climate denier or an agnostic, or you support or you view climate science in a particular way. The more expensive carbon fuel gets, the more profit there is in saving it. It's that simple.
Exactly.
It seems to me as well that the communication of these ideas and the communication of threats is absolutely key. And of course, I'm going to say that as the journalist here. Claire also put something in the chat about this at the beginning of the panel. So it seems actually rather obvious as to why a government would jump and change its, 50 years of foreign policy and join NATO when Russia invades Ukraine, because Russia has been portrayed as nothing but a threat in the media in most countries over the past, few decades, and the decades prior to that when it was the Soviet Union as well. And the threat of Russia looms, the threat of all these kinds of things loom, and yet the climate crisis, climate destruction, it seems far more difficult to take responsibility for it, because number one, it demands a collective responsibility that war does not. War is collective within one's own borders, and yet there is still a common enemy. And so that sort of necessity of collective responsibility, necessity of collective response, also trust, another word that's come up here. It seems that the deliberate sort of miscommunication around the climate crisis is also engendering our inability to respond to it adequately. And even all of the ideas that have been presented here today just show the depth of the crisis. I mean, everybody has provided research and solutions even that attack a completely different part of the problem. And everything needs to be implemented all at once as an ecosystem of solutions in order to deal with the polycrisis. And yet, if we are unable to communicate the depths of it simply to either be powerful, whether or not their systems are working for them, TBC, and also the public, I suppose this is a question for everybody. How do we get the needle to move now?
And I hit you with Russia because I'm an expert on the global gas market, believe it or not. And for me, what's happened between Europe and the US and Russia when basically they weaponized the dollar and the euro were weaponized against Russia, and we saw their currency collapse within days, didn't we? It literally the rates went from 60, I think, to 120 rubles to the dollar, and it collapsed. And yet Putin then declared that, well, actually, you're going to have to, deliver. You're going to have to pay for the ruble, pay for gas in the ruble. What happened? It went back over the rate it was before, higher. And I thought to myself, well, what is gas? As I said in the chat, gas is MMBT. It's measured in MMBTUs, right? It is thermal energy in its sort of purest form. And in essence, what they did was they went on to, I call it a thermal gas standard, almost. They didn't do it in the other direction. So they've got problems actually importing anything. But what they've done is by mandating returnability, if you like, by mandating payment for gas in rubles, they took, in my view, that's the most significant monetary event since the gold standard was left. Seriously, I'm absolutely clear about that. How else could that collapse and rebound take place if it were not the case? I put that to you.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with my very simplistic take and not studying this in super detail of the Richard Adams stuff, right? You have the physical control of the environment, you can dictate social arrangements. And this is your point, Chris, that the West tried to impose this constraint on Russia, and Russia said, no, I'm the one that has the physical thing you want. I get to impose a constraint.
Exactly.
On you. Right. You're like, right. Yeah.
Simply put, Carey, well played, well put.
Yeah. So that, so is that that could be a thing to communicate, right? That here is this basic idea. We just experienced this idea recently. Now translate this to larger scopes of perspective, translate this to decarbonization, and then translate to how economists for Steve Keen's perceive the social relations you're able to control, and whether that's a basis in physical resources or not. And we would say, hey, this is why you need a different way of thinking. This is how decisions can really get made socially. They're grounded in physical reality.
Yeah, and practical steps, Carey. I mean, we say the last thing people need is cheaper energy. What they need is the means to pay. So what we advise these far-flung islands, we say, look, keep the price at whatever it is at high price. But what we will do is reduce your cost of producing by bringing in all sorts of technology suited to your environment. And then by issuing energy credit, literally issuing their own energy credits, putting themselves on the energy standard, they give their population the means to pay through what we call an energy dividend. It's a completely different approach, but it has to be tested on islands, you see, because we can't walk into a big country and do it for obvious reasons,
I think you just sort of answered my other question, how to translate your ideas to local effort to impact locally. But I think that's part of what you just said. If you get islands and another island sees how to do it, I mean, this is not saying anything new, but I'm kind of thinking practically as a person in the United States, how to do that. Maybe I just share a car with my closest friends because we know each other and we can agree to share a car instead of all buy a car or something like that. It's things that simple, I guess, but learn more about your sort of contractual structure.
That's what farmers did. Machinery rings, they just club together. I mean, for me, the future is cooperatives. Clubs and clubs and clubs and clubs. It's not cooperative organizations because they're just genetically modified companies, right?
Okay, you could educate me on the specific difference, but maybe that's the larger discussion.
What I see in place of, referring it to the expletive moment is that whole systems change really from growth to stability at a certain do or die moment, that they that the message gets passed throughout the system that we've got to change the system, and that in nature, if you study it, or in our own work, we grow our preparations for making dinner, for example, expanding what you take out and what you're going to do, and then you get to a point where it's a simple sort of do or die moment that you better stop expanding what you're going to finish and finish something, and you have to perfect the result. And so that switch from multiplying the possibilities of the system to perfecting the design of the system is something that every growth system that survives goes through. And we're a growth system, and we're headed for not surviving. And if there's a whole system recognition of the problem, we'll probably survive. But it's also possible that we have so many blinders on, there will be very large portions of the public that won't notice and just still stay in conflict mode. And so it's can we shift to caring for the system we built as a whole? But anyway, that's one of my points of view.
Thank you, Jesse. Everyone, thank you so much for your time today. This was so fascinating. As I said before, how everybody has come at a different part of the problem from different angles, showing just the variety and diversity of thoughts we need, solutions we need, and how much in shit we really are when dealing with this poly crisis. A huge thank you to Carey, Henrik, Yi, Steve, Chris, and Sally for your phenomenal presentations. They were absolutely fascinating. Having interviewed all of you, I still learned something new listening to you again. And a big thank you as well to everyone who's been listening and asking questions and getting involved in this debate. This was the very first Planet Critical Roundtable. There will definitely be another one. And yes, thank you all for your times.